Switch it up. We got the Western music playing in the background. I put a... I think I did. Anyway. Bit of water. Bit of water, bit of coffee. Oh, let's get comfy. Let's kick back. And listen. Pardon moi. Returning... Oof, there's the plosive on that one. Sorry about that. Returning home. Sammy Cox. Spencer woke with a start. Something was wrong. No, not wrong. Different. What was it? What was it? As he strained his hearing to pinpoint whatever had sounded so alien to him, he realized what it was. Indeed, instead of the sound of bustling traffic outside, there was nothing more than a silence periodically broken by the neighing of horses. He opened his eyes. As he stared about the room, it was with disappointment that he remembered where he was. Back in Montana. On his family's ranch, in his family home. Not his home. He hadn't called this place home since he'd left 10 years ago. He almost wished he was still in the hospital. Almost. But that would mean he was still on the other side of the country, and that was too painful for him to even contemplate. Since the accident, his whole life had changed, and he had lost everything. His girlfriend, his home, his job. A few too many late nights at work, trying to meet impossible deadlines, trying to meet impossible deadlines had been to blame. Walking down a flight of stairs in a near zombie state due to work-related exhaustion, he had missed a step and taken a tumble. Landing awkwardly, he'd woken up in the hospital a week later, and nothing was how he remembered it. That'd be fucking horrible. Imagine that. You don't even know what's happened. You just wake up in the hospital. Everyone's left you. You've lost your job. Tess, his young sister, had been at his bedside when he woke. It had fallen to her to break the bad news. Carla, his girlfriend, had left him. All his belongings had been packed up and placed in storage. Carla wanted a clean break. It was her apartment he had moved into, so he was the one to move out. And for his job, well, Carla's father was his boss. Of course, there was still a job for him if he wanted it. But wouldn't it be kinder for everyone if he took a few months of sick leave? Fully paid. And after that, found another job. There really was no need to prolong the pain when both parties should be trying to move on with their lives, working towards a fresh start. Never work for your girlfriend's boss. Girlfriend's dad even. Boss? No. Girlfriend's dad. Never have your girlfriend's dad as your boss. That's what I'm trying to say. Good advice. When Spencer had asked Tess if Carla had explained why, the answer she had repeated was brutal in its honesty. I'm too selfish to make even a half-decent nurse. I won't be able to take care of him, and who knows when he'll get better. By parting ways now, he won't resent me for not being able to give him what he needs in the future. It was Carla's way of saying she wouldn't resent him for not being able to live the life she wanted. Sitting up in the bed, he looked around his old room. Nothing in it had changed. The same posters were on the same blue wall. The furniture was where it had always been. But Spencer didn't take any comfort from that. It only served to remind him why he had left in the first place. For all the open space hereabouts, home felt stuffy, stifling, limited. A knock on the door disturbed his trip down memory lane. "Spencer, are you awake?" "Yeah, sure. Come in, Tess." Tess was almost as tall as Spencer, and where his hair was a dark blonde, hers was dark brown and rested on her shoulders in waves. She was 26 now, 4 years younger than her brother, but for all that, She had always been the more grown-up one of the two. She placed a tray on the bed in front of him. How are you feeling this morning? You glad to be home? It must be nice to wake up in your own bed, right? Tess, this hasn't been my bed for 10 years. Spencer didn't want to snap at her, after all she'd done for him. But if she thought he was going to stay here any longer than was necessary for his convalescence, she was in for a short, sharp shock. All he wanted was to get back to the bright lights of the city. The truck with all your things in it should be arriving today, she said, trying to change the subject. However, this was the perfect opportunity to let her know he wasn't staying. The sooner she got used to the idea, the more amiable she would be. And if he could break it to her gently, all the better. If I can store my stuff in one of the barns, there will be no need to unpack the boxes. It'll make it easier for when I find my place. You've been here for one night, Spencer, and you're already thinking of leaving? Can you hate it here that much? And what about your family? Do you hate me too? Tess's eyes filled with tears as she turned to leave the room. Tess, please don't go, Spencer called out after her, but it was too late. The door slammed closed, and she was gone. Spencer ate his breakfast alone in his room. Tess's reaction to what he had to say was far stronger than he anticipated. He hadn't intended to hurt her. Quite the opposite. She would be far more upset if he allowed her to think he was back at the ranch for good, only to up and leave again when he was better. She had to know that this was not a permanent move. When he was finished eating, he lay back on the bed. Although the doctors had said there was no lasting damage, they had to recommend a complete rest from work and stress. With the loss of his job and lacking a roof over his head, Tess had made the decision that he was to come back to the ranch. Someone needed to keep an eye on him, and she had volunteered for the job. She had insisted. When Spencer could argue with her no more, she had simply smiled and left his hospital room. By the time she returned, she had arranged for his stuff to be transported across the country, and all the other necessary preparations for his breakaway had been completed. Luckily, money wasn't a problem. His job had been a good one, therefore he had managed to squirrel away some savings for a rainy day. But out of work wouldn't cause him any difficulties, at least in the short term. However, his finances were not what was bothering him, but rather how he was going to fill the time whilst he was stuck in the middle of nowhere. He was so used to the constant activity of the city that the stillness of the country held no appeal to him. Turning to his side, Spencer caught sight of a small photo pinned to the wall. He got up to look at it, unpinning it. He scrutinized it carefully. A couple of kids, fresh out of school, were looking back at him. A couple of kids, fresh out of school, were looking back at him, or at least one of them was. The girl was looking at the camera, her eyes sparkling, whilst the boy was looking at her. Spencer could remember the day the photo was taken. He turned it over to find written on the back, Ashley and Spencer, forever and evermore. That was the problem with living in a small community. The past was always a constant threat hanging over your head. There was no distraction and memories to be found everywhere. There was no distraction and memories were to be found everywhere, materializing when you least expected them. With a sigh, he placed the photo in a drawer. There was no point in being reminded of Ashley. He had walked out on her when he walked out on everyone else. Perhaps returning home hadn't been the best idea, after all. The days passed as Spencer expected they would. Following the same routine he remembered from childhood, a few times he ventured out of the house, but never went too far. The doctor's warning of taking things easily constantly ringing in his ears, but at least it was good to get some fresh air into his lungs. He also did his best to keep out of everyone's way. A couple of times, the men invited him to join them, but each time he declined. He couldn't make friends with these people. He couldn't make any lasting ties or commitments. It would only make it harder to leave when the time came. Keeping to himself was his only option to make a clean break. And it was that which he kept in the forefront of his mind. He spent one day stacking his furniture and boxes in one of the empty barns. The boxes he combed through searching for anything that might stave off his boredom for even a short while. His TV, laptop, and a handful of books made their way back into the house and into his room, but he didn't seem to own much that could serve as a diversion. Another day, he went into town with Tess to do some shopping and immediately regretted it as he quickly became the center of attention. Some people came up to him to ask how he was doing. They all knew he had an accident. Some asked where he'd been, whilst others tried to pry into his private life. Did he have a significant other? Why was he not married yet? Had he come home to find himself a beautiful country girl? Those who didn't want to speak with him openly stared in his direction, exchanging hushed words if they were accompanied. He knew what to expect coming home, and things were worse than he had ever imagined. Their scrutiny was intense. He felt they were judging him and he couldn't stand it. As another person caught sight of Spencer and Tess and made a beeline straight towards them, his patience gave out entirely. Grabbing Tess's arm, he crossed the road, dragging his sister behind him. "Spencer, you know Mrs. Clayton wanted to speak with you." "So what? I'm not going to tell her anything she won't hear from other gossips in town." "But Spencer, I don't want to talk to her, alright? I don't want to talk to anyone. And before you say anything else, spare me the lecture, Tess. I don't want to hear it." "Do you think that you better learn some manners whilst you're here?" she hissed back at him. "Why? I'm not planning on staying that long." After their little exchange in town, Tess kept out of Spencer's way, their paths only crossing at mealtimes. Not that Spencer would have seen much of her, for his little sister was often very busy. He greatly admired her industrious nature and inexhaustible levels of energy, as well as helping run the ranch, something she had done since their father died a couple of years ago. She also produced handmade craft items that were sold in one of the shops in town. If it wasn't enough, she ran a number of clubs a couple of afternoons a week from their house too. It was after one of these that he accidentally ran into someone from his past, someone he wanted to avoid at any cost. Spencer had been walking down the stairs when he saw the familiar figure of Ashley crossing the hallway. For a moment, he thought he'd been transported back 10 years, and he missed a breath. She was just as he remembered her, tall, slim, with her light brown hair flowing down her back. He panicked. He didn't know what to do. He knew she'd seen him, but she pretended not to and carried on. But as he breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the crisis averted, she thought better of it and turned back around to speak to him. "Tess said you were coming home." "And here I am," Spencer said in a flat tone, which made his words sound far harsher than he meant. "I'm sorry, Ashley. I didn't mean... Only, I left to get away from gossip, and now it seems I'm at the center of it. You can hardly blame people for talking. You were here one minute, and the next you were gone. No one had a clue as to where. No one. Not even your family." Spencer coloured with embarrassment at Ashley's words, at what she implied. Not even me. "About that," he started, not knowing the right words to say, but he knew he needed to apologise for the way he'd treated her. It was a conversation that he had rather hoped he had never had to have, and he knew how cowardly that was. I'm really sorry." "It was a long time ago," Ashley said, cutting him off. She refused to look at him, so instead she looked at the clock. "Is that the time? I better go and pick up Jack." She moved towards the door, but stopped in the doorway. "It was nice to see you again, Spencer," she said in a manner that he couldn't read. It was soft but clipped and to the point. Before he had a chance to respond, she had left. The following day, over breakfast, Spencer decided to try and hold a decent conversation with his sister. He knew Tess and Ashley were friends, and so he thought that she would be pleased he was talking. He was taking an interest in her life. "I saw Ashley yesterday." "Oh." Tess didn't bother looking up from the patterns she was skimming through while she ate. "Yeah, in the hall. You could have warned me that she might be around." "Why? So you could run away again?" "Tess, it's a little unfair." "But it's true, isn't it?" Spencer sighed in response, an admission of his guilt. He couldn't deny that she was right. If he could have gotten away without speaking to her, he would have. A tense silence opened up between them, but he was determined to show Tess that he was trying. Who's Jack? Ashley's boyfriend? What? Tess spat out. She seemed surprised to hear that name coming from her brother. Ashley mentioned someone called Jack when we were talking. Who is he? Her boyfriend? No. Her husband? No. Her son, if you must know. Her son? Spencer had not expected to hear that. Her son? He said again, quieter this time. Yeah, he's 9. A good boy. His father about? No. Left her in the lurch? Yep. When she was pregnant. Poor Ashley, that must have been tough on her. Is that all you can say? Tess shouted as she gathered up her papers before storming out. A look of incredulity. It's too early for this. A look of incredulity on her face. Incredulity. Spencer knew coming home was going to be difficult, especially as he had simply disappeared overnight, not letting anyone know where he was or where he was heading. It wasn't until some months later he sent his sister a letter from the city, without any contact details, to let her know he was alright. Before taking off, he hadn't even mentioned leaving to anyone. Not his father, not Tess, not Ashley. And they all would have tried to talk him out of it, and they would have succeeded. Besides, no one had understood how he felt. It was like his life was beyond his control. Everything was mapped out for him, his life the product of the wishes and choices of other people. His father wanted him to take over the ranch. Ashley wanted to get married and start a family. And Tess, well, she was going to start her own little business, making things out of wool and fabric. She was handed the freedom and opportunity to make her own life, whilst Spencer was not. And at the time, he knew it was an awful thing to do, writing a brief note that said, "Sorry, I've got to go. There's a big world out there and I'm not going to see it stuck on this ranch," had been the only thing he had done to try and stop them from worrying. And yet he couldn't see another way out. He had it in his head that he had to go, and he had spent the last 10 years trying to block out the guilt of his actions. There were many occasions when the words, "I should never have left," crossed his mind, but he did his best to bury such sentiments. He had made the decision and there was no going back on it. More than that, he didn't want to admit he was wrong, even to himself. That was until the accident. Events had conspired against him and now he was home, having to face the consequences. Spencer grabbed the keys to the car and drove off. He needed to get away from the ranch. Growing up, he and Tess had gotten on well, but since his return, things had been anything but. He was trying, but it didn't seem to make any difference. Everything he had said, she took the wrong way and ended up arguing. Of course, he didn't blame her. How could he, when he had been the cause of so much? She had been so good to him, even though he had been awful to her. He wanted to make things right, and yet he had no idea how he could. Following the road back to town, he thought about buying her a present, or two. Something meaningful and practical, just like her. Tess was not a fan of frivolous, impersonal purchases. So he pulled up outside the store that stocked some of Tess's handcrafts and went in. "Good morning, Spencer. This is a nice surprise." "Morning, Mrs. Hamilton," he answered, taking a quick glance around the shop. The Hamiltons had been close friends of his parents. Soon, the owner was standing beside him. "I can imagine that you've had your fill of well wishes and such, so I'll keep this brief. I was awfully sorry to hear about your accident, but I can't say that I am sorry to see you back here, where you belong, if I might say." Putting her aged hand on his shoulder, she turned to face him. "My, you've become very handsome gentleman. Your mother and father would be proud of you." Spencer sighed, doubting her words. "Yeah, they would. They might not have agreed with your decisions, but that would not have stopped them from being proud of you. Trust me, your mother was my greatest friend." He muttered his thanks as she bustled her way back over to the counter. "So how are you finding life back here?" "Well, difficult. I'm not sure it was the right thing to do. Tess and I keep clashing." Mrs. Hamilton smiled kindly. "Is that why you're here? To find a present for Tess?" Yep. Any ideas?" "I don't care as long as it's practical. Not bothered by how much it costs either. It'll be worth it just to see if I can make her smile. Together, they searched the store. Eventually, Spencer decided on a tiered knitting caddy. Of course, the elderly lady had to explain to him what it was and how much Tess would love it. When he was done, he thanked Mrs. Hamilton and promised to come back soon to fix one of her display cabinets. It was the least he could do in return for her encouraging words and help. Then he popped next door to buy a bouquet of flowers before returning to his car. On the road back to the ranch, he decided to pull over and take in the view. He might not be overly pleased with being back in Montana, but he was still impressed by its picturesque nature. From here, he had a clear view of mountains, forests, and great expanses of grassland. Somehow, just looking at it seemed to settle him. Try as he might, he couldn't explain why. A car ambled up the road towards his own. It was only when it pulled up alongside his vehicle did he realise who was driving. Have you broken down? Ashley called out through her open window. No, I'm just admiring the view, he replied, climbing out of his car to talk to her. You know, I would have sworn I never missed it once. Not once when I was gone, but now I'm not so sure. Ashley got out too and looked in the same direction. It really is something, breathtakingly beautiful. Glancing at Ashley out of the corner of his eye as her long, light brown hair flowed behind her in the breeze, he couldn't help but utter, "Like you." The words were out before he could do anything about it. I'm sorry. I had no right to say that, he said quickly and then added, "But it's true, Ashley. You haven't changed a bit." Her eyes remained fixed at some point in the distance. Really? I'd have to disagree with you. Being a single parent takes its toll. Tess said your boy's 9 now. Yeah, I can't believe Jack will be 10 by the end of the year. Ashley turned to look at Spencer. He could feel her eyes on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet them. He was loath to admit it, but he was jealous that she had cared enough about someone else to have a child by them. He had no idea where it had come from, and it left him with an uncomfortable yet intense feeling in the pit of his stomach. Anyway, I better head home, she said, breaking the magic of the moment as she turned away. When she was safely ensconced in her car, Spencer remembered the flowers he had bought. Wait a minute, Ashley. I have something for you. Returning with the bouquet, he handed them over. She placed them on the seat next to her, not really looking at them. Flowers, Spencer? Your charm won't work on me anymore. You know that, right? There's no harm in trying, is there? He flashed her a smile. Things are different now. Jack's father disappeared when I was pregnant. He doesn't know he has a son, and even if he did, he wouldn't care. He's a terribly selfish man, only I didn't see it at the time, but that's alright. Jack and I, we're fine together. Just the two of us. And with that, she drove off without a backward glance. After Ashley's departure, Spencer returned to the ranch. He spent the hours until his sister's return trying not to mope about it. But he was finding it extremely difficult. Feelings he didn't want to acknowledge were raising their ugly head. He knew he had no right to feel the way he did about Ashley, but he couldn't help it. Eventually, he decided that he was going to cook dinner. When Tess arrived back at the ranch, he was dishing up. "What's this in aid of?" she asked, sitting down at the table, looking thoroughly impressed. Spencer sat down opposite her. "I just wanted you to know I'm trying to make things up to you. I'm sorry for the way I've been. It's never been my intention to upset you or make you angry with me. Not after all you've done. This is for you." He picked up the present he had picked out for her in town that morning and passed it over. Tess burst out laughing. "What? What's so funny?" Spencer asked, a look of amusement on his face. Had Mrs. Hamilton got it wrong when she said Tess would love the caddy? "I know you didn't pick this." He sighed with relief. "Well, I had a little help." "Thank you, Spencer. It's just what I was after. You'll have to thank Mrs. Hamilton too. They started to eat. The atmosphere between them for once. Easy. However, he couldn't help himself from trying to learn all he could about the father of Ashley's boy. I saw Ashley again today. She told me a bit about Jack's father, called him selfish. Apparently he doesn't know about the boy and wouldn't care if he did. Must have been hard raising him on her own. Tess stared at her brother before simply saying, well, she's done a great job. I always thought she would make a great mother. But having 2 men run out on her must have been tough. 2? Me and Jack's father. And in quick succession too. All in the space of what, a year? Well, I hope she was happy with him for a bit anyway. And she got Jack out of it, so it's not all bad, is it? Listen to yourself. All I'm saying is that she must have gotten over me quickly. That's all, Tess, and I'm glad. I wouldn't have wanted to hurt her. I didn't want to hurt anyone. And I hope whoever's made her happy for a while. Did you know him? Was she happy? Placing her cutlery on the plate, Tess shook her head. Are you really this stupid, Spencer? Join the dots. Her son is 9 years old. His name is the same as our father's. The father ran off when Ashley was pregnant. Is it coming together yet? Spencer's brow furrowed. She always got on with Dad. Tess growled in frustration. You really don't see it, do you? See what, Tess? Stop speaking in riddles, will you? He snapped, standing up to clear the table. Jack is your son, Spencer. You're Jack's father. As the words hit him, Spencer staggered back into his chair, shocked. His head fell into his hands, his blonde hair filling forward over his face. Spencer, are you alright? Tess asked, her tone far gentler than he thought he deserved. When I left, she was pregnant? He couldn't believe what he'd done. What he'd missed out on, all because he thought he needed to get away. He always told himself he had done the right thing in leaving. He hadn't been as happy here as people wanted to think. To stay, just because others wanted him to, would have been childish, cowardly. He had been a man in accepting that he had to go and make his own way in the world. These were the stupid excuses he had listened to again and again. For 10 years, he'd been deluding himself. Yes, we tried to find you, but nobody said anything, he exclaimed. I'm so sorry. It wasn't my call, and it certainly wasn't my place to tell you. After spending so long searching for you, Ashley asked us not to. The waiting, the not knowing, the uncertainty of what the future held was tearing us apart. She needed supporting, not a head full of hopes and dreams. So we did what she asked and took care of them both the best we could. And you had no intentions of coming back. You kept telling us that. This way, at least we got to see Jack grow up. Spencer clutched at his hair. I've messed up, Tess. I've messed up so bad. I left her alone to raise my child, my boy. What kind of person does that? Tess sat down next to him and pulled him into her. Suddenly overcome with emotion, Spencer pushed her away and stood up. I need some air, he said, and he marched out of the room. Spencer had no idea what he was doing, where he was going. All he knew was that he couldn't stay confined within that house, where his failures seemed to press in on him from all sides. Tessa's revelation had taken him by surprise, with such force that he couldn't think straight. He headed for the stables, saddled up one of the horses, and then, before he or anyone else knew it, he was galloping off, away from the house and its accusing atmosphere. The sun was low in the sky when he reached the creek. Dismounting, he let the horse graze, while he sat down on a rock, still warm from the day's heat, and he lost himself in thoughts. First, he wondered why he'd taken a horse and not the car. Then he wondered why he'd come to the creek. Out of all places he could have gone, he had spent many happy a day up there before he fled to the city. When he was a boy, before his mother had died, they used to have family picnics out on the grass. Then, when he finished high school, he used to take Ashley up there to get away from the prying eyes and the gossip. It was somewhere they could be alone. They could be together. And his mind turned back to Ashley. The guilt of what he had done washed over him, threatening to engulf him once more. He was cross at himself, but he was angry with the people around him too. Ashley never made mention of the fact that Jack was his when he'd spoken to her. He had been in contact with his family for years, albeit sporadically, but they never raised the subject of him being a father. He thought about his father's funeral, the only time he returned to Montana in those 10 years that he'd been gone. He had come back home for it, to say goodbye to his dad, but it was only a brief stay. Things had been hectic at work, and besides, at that time he had no plans to hang around and talk to people about old times. No small boy had stood at Ashley's side that day, but then Jack would have been too young to attend the funeral. There had been no clues for him to find, no indications to say that the world he lived in had changed. If he had known, would it have altered anything? Of course. Of course, he couldn't know for certain, but Spencer liked to think he would have done the right thing. It was only then, as the pain of his mistake threatened to consume him, that he realized that he had not felt anguish like this before. This was something new, something terrible. A month ago, when he was smarting the loss of his city existence, he thought he was hurting, but that was nothing. Now he could see that the only thing that had been hurt was his pride. He didn't really care for his job, and Carla, well, he couldn't remember the last time he had thought about her. However, seeing Ashley again had stirred up old memories. He had never met another woman like her. She was as beautiful as always, but it was more than that. There was something about her that spoke to his heart. Now, only learning that they had a child together, he cursed himself for being the fool that he was. Everything he had ever wanted had been here waiting for him all along, but he had been too proud to come home and admit that he'd been wrong. The problem was, he couldn't go back and change anything. Everything was as it was. There was nothing he could do about it. The only thing he had the power to change was the future, and that started with the present. Even though he'd been gone 10 years, the area around the ranch was as familiar to him as it had been when he had lived there. He followed the trail from the creek that headed towards the ridge. When he reached the road, he rode along it for a short way before turning off the track and heading back along the quiet drive. When he reached the house, he could see Ashley sitting on the front porch. A boy was reading a book close by. Spencer stopped about 20 yards from the house, but he didn't make to get off the horse. He just sat atop it for a while, staring. He noticed the flowers he'd given Ashley earlier were now sitting in a vase on the top step. After a few minutes, Ashley turned and spoke to Jack, who closed his book and went indoors. Then she descended the front steps and approached. Spencer dismounted. "Took you long enough to work it out. We've been waiting on the porch for hours." A silence opened up between them before she added, "I'm sorry about what I said on the road this afternoon. I was being spiteful, and I lashed out." "There's no need to apologize. I deserved it." Stroking the horse's mane, he asked quietly, "Did you know before I left that you were having a baby, or did you find out after I'd gone?" "I knew before, only I didn't know how to tell you. I was waiting for the right time. I thought I had all the time in the world to break the news to you, and I was scared. I didn't know how you'd react, or how anyone else would come to think of it. Then you disappeared, and I couldn't tell you. The months passed, still no one heard anything, and I didn't know what to do. Things got quite tough around here for a while," she said, a tear running down her cheek. "Even after Jack was born, I thought you'd come back and rescue me, rescue us. Take us both away with you like some kind of knight in shining armor, but you never did. I know I'm late, so very, very late. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. I promise I'll never leave you or Jack again. I swear it." Spencer picked up her hands and drew them to his mouth, and laid a kiss upon her knuckles. More tears started to stream down her face. "Forgive me if your pretty words don't convince me, Spencer. You made a promise similar to that once when I was 18, and you broke it." A pained look broke across his face. He remembered it. He had spent years trying to forget all the damage he'd done, the hurt he had caused, whilst telling himself that it was better for everyone, and look where that had gotten him. "I broke my word once before, Ashley, but I will never, never do so again. And I don't expect you to take my word for it. I'll prove it to you. I'll show you that you can trust me again. I know things will never be the same as they were. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I won't ask for forgiveness for what can't be forgiven. I wasn't there for you when you needed me the most. I've missed out on so much time with Jack, but I promise you, I will be here from now on if you need me. Both of you. Just say the word, and I will come running." Gently, Spencer let go of Ashley's hands and turned away, made to get back into the saddle. "I'll be at the ranch." So you're staying in Montana for good? I'm staying at the ranch for good. My home's here. Everything that is important to me is here. I'm a fool for taking so long to see it. He swung himself up onto the horse and turned to face the road. Thank you for listening, Ashley. You didn't have to. You owe me nothing. But I'm grateful that you did. And with that, he told the horse to start the ride back home. Spencer! Spencer! Ashley called, running after him. He slowed down and turned around. Where are you going? Don't you want to meet your son? It was late when Spencer finally returned home, after he had brushed down the horse and got him stabled. He walked into the kitchen to find a distressed Tess. Where have you been? I've been worried sick. It's been dark for hours. I'm sorry, Tess. I should have called. I thought you'd fallen off your horse, that you'd hurt yourself, or worse. I'm sorry. It was thoughtless of me to not call. Forgive me? Tess went to open her mouth to say something, but quickly closed it and looked sideways at her brother. Something was different about him. Tell me, she said, her tone indicating that she would have the truth and nothing else from him. Spencer smiled. I've been to see my son, he said, his voice quiet but proud. Tess threw her arms around him and squealed with delight. And? He's an amazing kid. Ashley's done a great job with him, and he's so smart, so much smarter than I was at that age. And he loves books. Tess. Books, of all things. He gets that from his mother. Sorry, I just can't believe it. I'm a dad, Tess. A dad. Spencer collapsed on a stool at the counter. So what does this mean? His sister asked, sitting down next to him. I'm not going anywhere, Tess. I've returned home for good. Wild horses couldn't drag me away now. Really? What about that woman named Carla? What? She rang while you were out. She said she made a mistake. I made a note of the message and her number. Bin it. I don't want it. My accident, everything that came with it, is the best thing that could have ever happened to me. And I won't undo it for anything. It sounds like my big brother has finally grown up. Well, I do have responsibilities now. Not just Jack, but on the ranch too. It's about time I started helping with the family business. I left you to fend for yourself for long enough. The burden is mine as well as yours. And if you want, it'll free you up to work towards that craft business you've always wanted. Tess squeezed his hand, her face beaming. And what about Ashley? She's as beautiful as ever, and I admire her for all she's been through and all she's done. I feel awful for being the cause of it, but I'm so grateful that she's raised my son to be the great kid I met this evening. And, Tess pressed, and she's invited me over for dinner tomorrow night. With the final revelation, Spencer bid his sister goodnight, climbing the stairs. He could still hear her squealing with joy in the kitchen. That night, lying in bed, he thanked his lucky stars no one had any right to be as happy as he felt. Especially someone who had left a trail of pain and destruction behind him as he did. He had spent the evening with his son, which was a blessing in itself, but as he made to take his leave, Ashley had called him back. Sitting together on the porch, they had laughed and joked, just as they had when they were teenagers. And then, when he leaned in to kiss her, it was surprised. He was surprised to feel her hand on his hair, pulling him into her. Afterwards, Spencer reluctantly pulled away. I'm sorry, Ashley, I'd no right to kiss you like that. Don't apologise, she retorted, grinning. I've been waiting a long time for that kiss. In companionable silence, they sat on the front porch, holding hands, Ashley resting her head on Spencer's shoulder. It was like those 10 years of separation had instantly vanished, and they were back being the two people from the photos on Spencer's bedroom wall. I love you, Ashley. It's always been you, you know that? Tracing patterns on his palm with her finger, she whispered, I know things won't be easy, and it'll take some time to forget, but I was wondering if you'd want to give us another go. I can't make any promises, but I'm willing to try, and not just for Jack's sake. I've never stopped loving you, Spencer, and I don't think I ever will. Crazy, huh? Smiling to himself, his heart swelled as he recalled each and every detail of his evening. Jack's cheeky grin, Ashley's eyes, his own inadequate feelings at being a father, wondering how he was going to make things up to both of them. One thing was for sure, he would never let Jack and Ashley down again. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't about to squander it away. Well, there you go. One of them with actually a happy ending. How about that? It's been a couple of sad endings in these short stories.